Okay, so upon entry, you will notice that all the participants will be muted. This is to avoid any disturbances. Please refrain from unmuting yourself. If you have any questions during the seminar, then please can you use the chat facility. This is posted at the bottom. You can put in your questions and your comments there. Prof will then revert to the chat facility after she has completed her seminar to address your questions and comments. Additionally, during the Q&A session, if you do have any comments or questions, please use the raise hand facility. This is also at the bottom of your screen. You will see raise hand. I will then indicate that I'm taking a round of 3 questions. I will tell you that I'm unmuting you, and then you can raise your question to Prof. Okay, so let me welcome today's speaker. This is Prof. Mzi Nduna from the University of Wits at the Psychology Department. Prof. Nduna is an active member in the community, academic and scientific realms. She has cultivated numerous publications and is actively involved as a member on various scientific organizations and institutions. Prof. Nduna, we are pleased to have you with us today, and we look forward to your presentation as well as the knowledge and the insight that you will share with us. Thank you, Prof. You may begin.
Thank you, Shanaz, and greetings to all our participants. Thank you for showing an interest in our work and joining this web-based seminar. I am not a stranger to the department. I have been there before, and that was before lockdown. I miss the department. I miss Prof. Maharaj and the members of the department and the students. But here we are now, meeting on Zoom to talk about a topic of interest to me, to you as well, and that is why you've joined this seminar. I've given today's seminar a title, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, when sex between educator and student is not a choice. And oh, Shana, oh, sure, it's happening. So I'm sure there are a few reasons why people are interested in this topic, apart from the team that's registered as students in the department. When you look at my topic, some of you probably are expecting me to tell you about some educators who are having sex with learners. I'm not going to do that today. Or they are expecting me to tell you about some learners who've made it through school by having sex with their educators. I'm not going to tell that either, but I am going to go through what is on the presentation outline. And I've decided to stay away from the gossip of who is having sex with who, because I think you already know all those people. You know which educators, you know which learners. So I'm not gonna bore you by telling you things that you already know. So I'm not going to go through the presentation outline either, but I'm going to start the conversation by inviting us to look at the school enrollment. And this is something that we have found resonates in the whole region. It is not only in South Africa. So I would invite, if there are people in this webinar today who come from other countries, to perhaps comment at the end and tell us how it is in other parts of the region. But in South Africa, what we know is that there is a large number of girls who are enrolled at age 5. And school starts formally, officially, age 7, but we encourage parents to start sending their children to early childhood development by age 5. We also know that gender differences in school progression have remained consistent over the years. And in fact, these have widened in favor of the girl child. And that is why if you go to a graduation at any university today, there are more women who are graduating than there are men. And we really clap for them. We clap a lot for them. So girls are more likely than boys to progress through school at an expected rate, and the difference becomes pronounced at higher grades. We also know that in 2017, 91% of girls aged 10 to 11 completed grade 3. And that is compared to only 87% of boys. We know that 77% of 16 to 17-year-old girls had completed grade 9 in the same year compared to boys of the same age. We also know that evidence suggests that for children to be able to stay enrolled in school, beyond primary school, it's very important that their parents should afford to keep their girls at school. In Southern Africa, in the region, neither basic education nor further education and training is provided at a little or no cost to families. And what we have seen is that there is a significant difference in grade completion across quantiles, especially amongst children who have completed grade 9. In 2018, for example, research tells us that about 64% of 16 to 17-year-olds in the poorest 20% of households in South Africa had completed grade 9. This is compared to 84% in the richest 20% of households who had completed grade 9. I personally think that the richest households could do better than 84%, but I think that is still a big difference between the different quantiles. In South Africa, some 50% of children have dropped out of school by grade 12, and that is not a good sign. A national cross-sectional study that was conducted in Zimbabwe gives us reasons why children in Zimbabwe drop out of school, and only 4% of those who have dropped out of school cited pregnancy as their reason for doing so, compared to 44%, 44.7% who reported that they dropped out because they could not afford school fees. And this is important for the audience for today, because the audience today is primarily students who are enrolled for sexual and reproductive health studies. And it's important for us to understand why the panic around pregnancy as a reason for girls dropping out of school, when in fact we know that a majority of students who drop out of school do not drop out because they were pregnant. Some 35% of those who were interviewed in a study, which is cited in a book that I believe everyone should have by now, by Morrell and Davey, Babies and Books on Babies or Books, is the title of the book. 35% of people who were interviewed in that study cited economic reasons as their main reason for leaving school. That book, I think, is downloadable online from the HSRC. I would encourage you to read it. And these statistics are corroborated by General Household Survey from Stats SA, and I'm going to show you a table now that is derived from the Stats SA work. These are reasons that are given for dropping out of school by learners in South Africa, and we can see 23.5% of learners who dropped out of school did so because they did not have money for school fees. 17.7% could not perform academically at school. 11% had too many family commitments. 10% cited illness or disability. 9% found that education was useless for them, and that's an indictment for people like us who are educators. And 7.8% had completed or felt that they've completed the level of school that they wanted. 6.7% were working at home, and 0.5% were struggling to get to school. About 12% of those respondents cited other reasons that were not specified. Now, I started recently to invite everyone, when we look at data, to always bring your magnifying glass and magnify the glass to what this data means. So I'm going to do that now with these statistics. And this is not to say the research that has been conducted by these people is not good research. This is not being critical of them, but it is inviting us to always use a magnifying glass and always take a fine-tooth comb when we examine data. And that is very important, because there are students in this webinar who are registered for their masters and PhDs. And we are trying to build critical mass, and we're trying to build tomorrow's decision makers. And so it's important that when we interact with data, we are able to ask questions. So when I looked at this data, number 2 is a reason that is related to academic performance, and 17% of those who could not continue to school because academically they could not perform well. I argue, if they had money, they could have paid for academic enrichment, and academic enrichment could have allowed them to stay in school. 11% of these said they had too many family commitments, and I argue, money makes the world go round. I know not everybody thinks that money makes the world go round, but you can outsource some of your family responsibilities if you have access to finances. 11% of those, 10% of those said that it was because of illness or disability. And again, I argue that if we provide financial resources, ill health can be resolved quicker and more effectively, so that it is not a reason for learners to drop out of school because of either their own ill health or an ill health that's affecting a member of their family. I also argue that if we had adequate enhancement for disability at home and at school, the students who say that they dropped out of school because of disability would not have dropped out of school. So what I'm trying to say here is reasons number 2, 3, 4, for me, it is possible that if you apply a fine tooth comb and a magnifying glass, those reasons have something to do with finance. That 50% of learners who drop out of school could stay if finance was available for them. So if you add that 17.7, 11.6, and 10.4, and if you want to stretch it, look further down in reason cited number 8, where some of the participants said that they could not continue with school because they could not get to school. It is possible that not being able to get to school was because of transport limitations. For example, maybe the school is far. And if you struggle to get to school, if there was finances, then you would be able to do that. So if you put all of that together, it is possible that we are dealing with about 75% of learners who drop out of school because of financial reasons. So it's very important that when we talk about schools and why learners are not at schools, because we come from a sexual reproductive health background, we often want to defer the reasons to pregnancy, especially for girls. And yet there is evidence that suggests that not only in South Africa, but in other countries as well in the southern region, that it is reasons that are related to finances that are the main reasons why learners drop out of school. We're not talking about private education because we know that private education is heavily commoditized and priced to be a privilege. We are talking about public basic education. And whilst in some schools, public basic education is afforded to schools for free, we call them no-fee schools in South Africa. In fact, the hidden costs of education, such as school fees, even if it's a no-fee schools, there's always fees that you have to pay for one thing or the other. School uniforms you have to buy, material to support the learners through school, nutrition, even though some schools, especially at primary level, provide nutrition. If you then go up the grades, that is discontinued. So children from poorer households cannot afford. Children from low income households cannot afford. And that is why for as far back as 2003, we had about 40% of children from the poorest households who could not afford to access education. Now, people in this webinar are making an assumption now that they belong to the stay in school committee that does not exist. We all belong to this stay in school committee because we think that it's very important for girls to remain at school. We support the keeping girls in school interventions for sexual and reproductive health. They are good for developmental outcomes, and there is no doubt about that we support that children, and in particular girls, should remain at school. However, when we do that, we always need to be mindful that there are some households in South Africa where there is no gainfully employed adult. We need to face the reality that some households in South Africa survive entirely on a single old age pension. And the last time I checked, the old age pension was 2,150 or so. And that is definitely not adequate to cater for a family. And where a family survives on a single old age pension, it is again likely, we know because in this webinar there are students from demographics, that in those families there's intergenerational arrangements. There's grandparents and their parents and their grandchildren living in the same households, and the old age pension is not enough. Some of these families also have other forms of grants, your social grants, your disability grants, your child support grants. And in other cases, in fact, most cases, fortunately, we just came out of from a celebrated Father's Day. So we know how many of single parents were posting on social media about being single parents, and so also wanted to be celebrated for being both mother and father. So we have a lot of families in South Africa that rely on single parent income. And this single parent tends to be a woman. There is a report from the University of Stellenbosch that I would like to invite you to read. It has been recently published by Professor Bosch from the School of Business Studies. I think it's Business Studies at the University of Stellenbosch. It's a recent report. It is not the only report that reminds us that women are collectively paid less than men in this country. So those single women tend to earn less than men. What this means is that adolescent girls and young women's choice to sequence in life is impossible. I want to introduce you to the concept of the sequential model. I am not going to dwell on it. You can get hold of the book Love, Money, and HIV by Sanyo Mojola, and that is the book that introduced me to the concept of the sequential model. This concept suggests that there are two things that young people would do. Let me start with what is not the sequential model, which is the combination model. The combination model is where your young people will combine being mature adults with being learners. So they would date and have relationships, and they'll start to become sexually active whilst also continuing with their education. So that's the combination model. But I want to focus now on what seems to be favored by most sexual reproductive health and rights interventions that are targeted at adolescent girls and young women, which is the sequential model, which is the model that suggests that you will be dedicated to school, you will love school, you will do well in school, you will prioritize school. Once you finish school, then you can think about other things. So you can get a job. Once you get a job, you will be a big girl and you'll be empowered. You can get someone who likes you and you can like them in a heterosexual setting, because this book is mainly about heterosexual relationships. And that the person is going to marry you and you will say yes when they go down on their knees, and that you will move out of your home to a flat and you could buy a starter pack. So that is the sequential model. That is what we hope that girls are going to go through. But that is not what is happening, and that is why I introduced you to what is called the combination model, which is also discussed in this book, but which does not seem to be supported by most sexual and reproductive health interventions. And because it is not supported, we silence it, we say less about it, we don't resource it, because we want to believe that everybody should follow the sequential model. Remember, in the combination model, there is what we researchers, we call it transactional sex. We call it transactional sex because you get something as a girl in return for being in this relationship with the person that you are dating. So the proponents of the sequential model believes that if adolescent girls and young women were able to set aside their appetite for luxurious consumption, then transactional sex will be averted, because we believe that young women are in transactional relationships for the cash that the sugar daddy or the taxi driver or whoever has disposable cash is giving them. So we think they are there for the iPhone. We think they are there for the Brazilian weave. We think they are there for the good time. We have all these things that we think they are in these relationships for. And we therefore think that if only young people could set aside their appetite for luxury, then transactional sex will be averted. And then we think that if transactional sex is averted, adolescent girls and young women will be protected from inequitable relationships. And we say this because we believe that the relationships that young girls get into where they have benefits are inequitable. And the source of the gender power inequitability in those relationships is age. The partner is usually older. It's resources. The partner usually has the money and so calls the shots. It's status. The partner usually is a somebody in the society. And so also the partner is male in a heterosexual relationship. So age and male gender and status, the educator, all of those, they actually tilt the scale so that he has more power in this relationship. And because he has more power in the relationship, then we believe that the girl in the relationship is unable to negotiate things like condom use. We therefore assume that if adolescent girls and young women do not enter gender power in equitable relationships, they will be protected against sexual ill health outcomes such as sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. There is a lot of work around transactional sexual relationships and risk for HIV. There is a lot of work on transactional relationships and pregnancy, because we believe that when girls and young women are in transactional sexual relationships, they cannot negotiate condom use. And so if they are not on a method of contraception that they can control and hide from their partner, such as an injection or a pill, then they are at risk of falling pregnant. We also believe that if adolescent girls and young women were not in gender power in equitable relationships, they would be protected against gender-based violence, because we believe that the power relations that are tilted makes it easy for their partner, for example, to dominate in the relationships to the extent that they may be violent to the adolescent girls and young women. And we worry a lot in South Africa these days about young women's risk for femicide in relationships. So an appetite for luxurious consumption is the one that we assume fuels transactional sex in young people. I want to say that there is a lot of research on this, and while some of the transactional sex is, yes, motivated by consumption of luxurious goods, there may just well be transactional sexual relationships that exist to support the noble achievement of education. So yes, there is evidence that some of the transactional sex is for substantive reasons. And there is a lot of evidence as well that points to that. But it is amongst older women, where, for example, it's access to a house where you feel that if you don't sit into this, if you don't agree to the relationship, then you might lose your access to your children, you might lose their house, you might lose his support. But for younger adolescent girls and women, it could just be possible that to be able to finish school, for some of them, they need access to income. They need access to income that's going to help them support their education. Otherwise, those of us who sit in the non-existent Keep Girls at School committee might be disappointed when these girls do not finish school, and we do not understand why. So whilst young women's education, we believe, results in decision-making power, and this is the decision-making power that facilitates safer sexual choices, this needs to be examined with what I call a fine-tooth comb. And I would like to introduce you to a book that I have written. It's a monograph that has just been published by the Center for Sexuality, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. I'm going to ask Shanaz at the end of the webinar to be in contact with me, so that we make arrangements for the students to receive copies of this book. You don't have to worry about transactional relationships for this book. It is available for free and courtesy of the Embassy of Ireland. So promoting sequencing, we know that is to bridge the gender inequitable gap through education. That is a good strategy. But like many other good strategies, it may not work for everyone. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, that when we do a lot of research and we provide a lot of evidence for good strategies, they may not be a one-size-fits-all type of strategies. So I want to take us to a conversation of why this may not be a strategy for everyone. So it is possible that successful sequencing, which is the prioritizing of education over sexual relationships for some adolescent girls and young women, is facilitated by transactional sex, without which those adolescent girls and young women will remain uneducated and locked in poverty. And that is why I suggest in the title for this webinar that these adolescent girls and young women are then caught between a rock and a hard place. They want the education this side, but to be able to continue with their education, they need income. They need something to support them to stay in school. And so they are caught between the rock and a hard place. And in terms of data, it's important that we ask some questions. For example, which girls are most at risk of dropping out of school due to finances? We heard earlier that about 40% of children drop out of school because of finances. But yes, there are girls who drop out because of other reasons. But it's very important that we know as a country, and especially for duty bearers and decision makers, which girls are at risk of dropping out of school due to finances. then we need to think about how do we keep girls from the lowest socio-economic strata in school, because indeed they are caught between a rock and a hard place. What proportion of girls and young women engage in transactional sex principally for substantive reasons? For whom, if there was no relationship with this person who is supporting, life would be difficult. That is what I'm trying to say. That life would be so difficult that they would not be able to progress through school. And we need to know what proportion of girls do so to obtain luxury goods, so that we do not paint all the adolescent girls and young women who are in transactional relationships with the same brush, that they are there for luxurious goods, because it might just be some of them are there because they need to put the money in the kitty for their education. We need to know what proportion of girls engage in transactional sex for both. So today, I'm not going to talk about transactional sex for luxurious goods, but I don't want you to leave this webinar thinking that I um I am suggesting that it is not a good idea. For people who are in that situation, it's a conversation for us for another day. So we have blind spots in terms of data that exists. And this is because of our sure real presumption that girls and young women are not compelled to engage in transactional sex in order to meet their basic needs. Chief among their basic needs is education. If you read the history of the introduction of education in Africa, and we are not unique in South Africa, you will know that historically, education was introduced to men. We have made a lot of strides, like really big strides. I was trying to convince a student of mine last week that we are sitting on the shoulders of big giant feminists who have fought the fight to make sure that women, not only girls and adolescent girls and young women, but generally women are able to go through and progress and become professors today. However, men still remain the educated elite, and they are aware of their power as the educated elite. In the basic education field, they are aware of their power as educators, as head of departments, as deputy teachers, as principals, and as officials. And all these men are at risk of being in relationships or getting in relationships with learners. Male educators take advantage of poorer adolescent girls and young women's economic vulnerability, and these adolescent girls and young women's determination to remain in school and to complete their education. Male educators are the ones who promise adolescent girls and young women gainful relationships. And such support that they promise may be essential for the learners and sometimes for their families too. Students may reason that it is foolish to resist sexual advances of a teacher if agreeing to these sexual advances means that you're going to have access to question papers. Like, really, who doesn't want to pass? If it means that certainly you will pass your grade. If you are from a struggling family, failing and repeating a grade is disastrous for your family, because you need to move so that you can get a job and work and save your family from the situation that they are in. But also if it means status amongst your families, and also if it means a good time come weekend. And for some, the money is not only enough for them to go through their schooling, it's also money that they use to support their families and to relieve their families. So there is a problem here with educators that are taking advantage of the situation. In some countries, we know that there are laws that prohibit relationships between educators and learners. In South Africa, the official age of consent is 16. What that means is a 16-year-old may consent to have sex with another 16-year-old or 15-year-old if they want. However, adults who are over 18 are not supposed to have sex with minors. So a 25-year-old is not supposed to have a sex with a young girl. And yet a 25-year-old can be an educator in South Africa. I mean, you can graduate by 21, 22 as a teacher and go and teach. You are not supposed to have sex with minors at school. We consider anyone under 18 a minor. If they do have sex, they should be having sex amongst and between themselves. And we have a law, in fact, that should deter that. It's called the statutory rape law. It's been in existence for the longest. However, the implementation of this law does not always take place. And we know it doesn't take place because schools are sites of sexism themselves. violations and abuse of girls and young women in these schools is not taken as seriously as we should be taking it. And as a result, a thigh for sex continues unabated because of the bystander behavior, because the school governing bodies, which are made up of educators, learners, and parents, are not equipped, empowered to not turn a blind eye. And that's why it's very important that we focus as well in the work that we do on sexual reproductive health on the bystander behavior, because it is the bystanders, it is the school governing bodies that are tasked with the authority to implement the laws such as the statutory rape laws. So when we don't implement these policies, sexually transmitted marks continue unabated owing to the negative consequences for those who do take a stand against the victimization of students, because there are educators, there are learners, there are parents, there are members of the community who take a stand against the abuse of power by educators, and these might find themselves being victimized. What we call sexual harassment continues unabated because some of the perpetrators remain in the education system, they remain influential in these schools, and they may even be elevated to powerful positions, and thus worsening the situation for adolescent girls and young women. In conclusion, I just want to bring our thoughts to a few things. One, research regarding the reasons for Southern African learners dropping out of school suggests that learners drop out of school mainly for economic reasons. And I invite you to look at research from other countries as well in the region. So, can we, sexual reproductive health and rights advocates, stop blaming pregnancy as a reason why girls drop out of school? Yes, some of them do get pregnant, and when they get pregnant, some of them go back to school. But again, that's a conversation for another day. You should read the book Babies or Books to be able to get that conversation about those who don't get back to school and why they don't get back to school. What we know is that immediate survival needs and the offers of a caring educator may lay adolescent girls and young women to engage in consensual relationships for benefits. So, not all of these relationships with educators are forced relationships. When you are caught between a rock and a hard place, you have to make a decision, you have to make a choice. But because we do not know what choices these young girls have, we tend to blame them for getting themselves in these situations. Economic vulnerability may compel some adolescent girls and young women to consent to relationships with educators in order to access some of the material support to enable them to remain at school. And so we should stop thinking that transactional sex is avoidable for all. Yes, some people may be able to avoid getting into transactional sexual relationships, but we should suspend our moral judgment for young people who are in transactional sexual relationships. And instead of focusing our energies on moral judgment of transactional sex, I suggest that we look at other ways of addressing the problem. Vertical social cohesion, for example, is one of the things that we could look at for addressing the problem that we are faced with. I'm going to talk about social cohesion in my last slide, which is next after this one. But I just want to remind us that the problems that I've highlighted in this presentation are going to be compounded by the COVID-19 situation. Because during COVID-19, some of the elderly household heads may succumb to the virus. Remember, it means those households who relied on the old age pension will lose that income because they are not going to have access to it if the household heads who are elderly succumb to the virus. Also, post COVID-19, children's responsibilities in their homes are going to increase. Remember, there are already children who reported that they drop out of school because of family responsibilities. And I want to argue that when we do not get statistics that is disaggregated by gender, it's very difficult for us to know what we mean by a child. And here, knowing the responsibilities that women currently carry in their houses during the COVID-19 lockdown, I know that that reads a girl child for me. Post COVID-19 lockdown, some women household heads will have earned less during the lockdown. They would have lost income, and some people are going to lose their jobs. And we know that this means those households that are headed by single parents who are women are then going to suffer most. Often, learners as a result of COVID-19 will be at a heightened risk to drop out of school. Learners will drop out of school due to family responsibilities post COVID-19. Adolescent girls and young women will be at an increased risk for transactional sex post COVID-19. We're going to send them back to school, and often adolescent girls and young women are going to be at a heightened vulnerability for advances from educators who are promising a relief to them. So my last slide goes back to vertical social cohesion. I want to invite sexual and reproductive health advocates in education, in addition to all the other strategies that we use, to also consider also focusing on what is called vertical social cohesion. So vertical social cohesion, the two concepts in social cohesion is the horizontal social cohesion. You can read about it, and then the vertical social cohesion, which looks at the levels of inequity and income distribution in the society. It's important that we look at inequity and income distribution, because where there is an unfair income distribution in the community, in the society, it's very difficult for us to achieve cohesion as a society. And cohesion is essentially an endogenous process. What that means is we're not going to get people coming from outside to come and work on this for us. We have to work on this ourselves. It is now our responsibility to work towards a more cohesive society post-COVID-19. It is going to be our responsibility because there will be job losses, there will be high unemployment post-COVID-19. So we have to work towards creating an environment that is conducive to economic growth as citizens of the countries. We have to work towards reducing inequality in access to jobs. We have to strengthen our anti-discrimination legislation and workplace policies. And we have to work on access to information on rights, on legal protection for all, including migrants, because the situation of migrants is going to worsen in South Africa post-COVID-19. When we advocate for sexual and reproductive health, we have to remember that it exists in a context. And so it's very important that post-COVID-19, as it was important before, that those of us who work in the field of health and human rights and sexual and reproductive health understand that we've got to support affirmative action, implementation of affirmative action policies. We've got to support jobs which are empowering and jobs that build agency and provide access and voice to men and women, and in particular to women. Because if we do not achieve economic growth, we are not going to see gains in sexual and reproductive health. In fact, we are going to see the gains that we have made in sexual and reproductive health being reversed post-COVID-19 if we do not put an effort in social cohesion as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for such an amazing presentation. It was very insightful and very useful, especially since you picked on such relevant topics that are currently being discussed in the media and in the research realm, like education, economic challenges, gender-based violence, femicide. And I think it's so important, or it's so interesting that you also made, reference to the COVID-19 pandemic, because like what I've taken from your presentation is that it's really, the challenges are really going to be compounded and exacerbated by the current pandemic. And we really need to think beyond how we're going to address all of these current challenges. So thank you for that, Prof. We're going to now revert to the chat. I see that there's a few questions there that have been posted for you. However, if anyone else would like to pose questions, you may please use the raise hand facility. Okay, Prof. So our first question is from Nompilo Mjwara. She asks, does education change gender norms in heterosexual relationships? For example, if a girl is educated, can she dominate in the relationship regardless of the male's finances or education? Do you want to respond to that, Prof, and then we can move on?
Oh, sure, I can respond to that.
Yeah.
So research tells us that there are a number of factors that are sources of power. Education is just one of the sources of power. However, gender is a source of power, regardless of the in a heterosexual relationship of the woman's education status. We have raised boys and we continue to afford to men a particular position of power just because of their gender. But there's also other aspects of our culture that I'm going to say in inverted commas diminish the education of a woman. So regardless of your education in your relationship, there will be expectations that you will concede some power to him because he is a man. And he might have other status in the society, for example, because of the job that he does. I don't want to mention jobs. We know which jobs seem to be attracting status. So you might be educated, but he's doing a job that is considered to be a high status job by the society, and he might then draw power from that. There's also positions in our society that are not job related. Like there are people who are born in particular positions in the society, and those people want to claim particular status and power. There's race as well. There's religion. So there are many factors that will influence whether the woman, because of her education, will then have power in a relationship. It is not always the case that it is just power, because it is just education or income that results from your education.
Right, thank you, Prof. And then Prof. Maraj is asking, what about boys? What are the reasons for them dropping out of school?
So I did expect that I was going to be asked that question. Then I wanted to make a disclaimer at the beginning. Then I thought they know that that I'm talking about girls, so I'm not going to talk about boys. So I did not prepare to talk about boys, and I did not do um, a um, a research of the reasons why boys drop out of school. But I think we can assume that they are also affected by all the other reasons that were listed. For example, illness, disability, inability to get to school, not doing well at school, feeling that you have done your levels, feeling that you are now adequately prepared to face the society. And I think those might be some of the reasons. And also in our context, we cannot take out substance use. I don't work in the field of substance use, but I think substance use could also contribute to some of the boys dropping out of school. But I think that's a presentation for another day. We do need to know why boys are dropping out of school.
Okay. Then we have a comment by Mzamo Biase. She says, or he says, children are so vulnerable and have a pressure from their homes. It's so sad. I think that's more of a comment than a question, Prof. And then we have another question from Prof. Maraj saying, COVID is going to lead to poverty and unemployment, but also more stress and also gender-based violence, as we are already seen and portrayed in the number of cases as profiled in the media. I think that's also more of a comment, Prof. And then we have another question from Nompilo Mjwara. What are some of the challenges that they are facing in sexual reproductive health services during the COVID-19 pandemic? I think Nompilo is making specific reference to an institution. Let me just unmute Nompilo. Nompilo, can you please clarify your question?
Okay, thanks, Shanaz. So my question was, what are some of the challenges that adolescent girls and young women are facing currently in accessing sexual reproductive health services, especially during this pandemic? Thank you.
So I think generally we've been following reports generally that the health services are seeing less and less people visiting for other reasons. So the lockdown has resulted in people staying away from the clinics. So that's one of the things that has happened even with young people. I would imagine, I would love to do or to read a study a year later of the rate of unintended, unplanned, or I don't want to say unwanted pregnancies, to look at that and in relation to the period of the lockdown, because I do want to think that some people have stayed away from visiting their clinics for their dates for contraception, for example, because it is just a very different environment. People are scared of catching COVID-19 in clinics, but also they do hear from the social media that the health facilities are overwhelmed and that they are full. And so people are trying to not overburden a burdened healthcare system by going for things that they think can wait. So they might be in that situation where they think they can wait. But I think we need to do research on the impact of COVID-19 on women's sexual reproductive health. So people may not go for STI treatment, people may not go for contraceptives, people may not go back for antiretroviral drugs. We are going to see a knock-on effect on other services. Not because people have been told to not come, but people are not coming because of the environment.
Okay, Prof. The next person that is posing a question or comment is Bongiwe. Bongiwe says, at what age could we comfortably say that young people can consent to these age disparate relationships? I believe the sequential model tries to navigate this, and as much as it seems punitive, it is designed to be protective. Do you want to comment on that, Prof?
Yes. So, as an advocate of sexual and reproductive health and rights, I think that young people should never consent to these relationships. I think that young people should not be in risky relationships. However, in a context that we've just described in the presentation and that we read of every day, we do see young people consenting to these relationships. So I do not think that we need to even debate whether there should be an age where young people should consent to these relationships. I think we need to focus on empowerment. I think we need to focus on making sure that adolescent girls and young women are never put in a situation where they have to drop out of school because they can't afford school fees, because they don't have uniform, because they don't have nutrition, because they can't afford a bus fare to school, they can't afford extracurricular activities, they can't afford school enhancement. So because they can't afford all these things that are required for them to stay in school, I think we should, in an ideal world, achieve 100% school completion for every child in this country. But we don't live in an ideal world. So I don't think the sequential model is a punitive model per se. I think the sequential model is a model that will work for some young people. And the combination model, because of their background and their context, may work in advancing other young people. And so I think we should not be punitive and focus on only supporting the sequential model and not put in place mechanisms to support young people for whom the combination model is what is going to get them through. I think what is important for me is that we acknowledge that the two models exist in reality. However, a lot of support from sexual and reproductive health resources go to the sequential model.
Thank you for that extensive explanation, Prof. There's another question and comment from Bongiwe. So Bongiwe says, I agree not to moralize the issue, but what about a public health-based risk mitigation strategy which promotes the same without necessarily moralizing? Also, how much of age disparate sex is promoted by consumerism and not poverty?
So the question is, what about public health-based risk mitigation strategy?
Yes.
Which promotes what? Which promotes the sequential or the combination model? I think what we see now is our public health-based risk mitigation strategies are promoting the sequential model. So because they are promoting the sequential model, there's very little that we hear about what should you do if you are in a combination model, right? Because we want the combination model to not exist. We want young people to not choose the combination model. So because we want young people to not be in relationships for financial gain, we then tell them how not to be in these relationships for financial gain. So we tell them it's important that they focus in education, but we don't acknowledge sometimes the context that breeds the combination model, the context that forces some of these young people to have a relationship that they rely on to be able to continue with their education. So the question of moralizing is a very important question, because we then moralize the combination model. And what we should be doing is to support the system and focus on structural changes in such a way that no young person, no adolescent girl and young women finds themselves between a rock and a hard place.
Okay. So we have a question from Zonele. Is there research being done on young women who turn to sex work to generate income to support themselves and families while going through their studies, and how the legalization of sex work would aid or hinder these young women?
Sorry, that's a question from?
Zonele.
Zonele. Okay, is there research being done on young women who turn sex work to generate income?
Yeah.
To provide themselves. There is a lot of research that's being done by organizations that work on sex work, organizations, for example, like Sweat and Sisonke. However, because when we do research, doing research with under 18s is not easy in this country. I have met in my professional space researchers who choose not to do research with young people below the age of 18, because they need to not deal with the ethics committees around the ethics of interviewing children. So that makes it very difficult for us, Zonele, to know what is the extent of engagement in sex work and transactional sex for young people who are below the age of 18. And I think it's a situation that needs to be resolved. And it needs to be resolved by ethics and researchers, so that researchers do not shy away from conducting studies with younger people. And the reason they shy away, we do know that they also work under pressures for time. They need to finish their research on time. And so they don't want to get themselves into a sticky situation and a big dark hole of back and forth with the ethics committee about interviewing people at risk, because under 18s in this country are considered vulnerable children, young, at risk. And so people want sometimes to choose to do what is easy. And that is why we know a lot more about young adults than we do about children's engagement in sex work and transactional sex. And perhaps I could also at this point answer the question from Bongwe that links to this question, which is how much of the age disparate sex is promoted by consumerism and not poverty. And Bongwe, as if you had read my slides before this morning, because I had that question in my slides before this morning, then I removed that slide. And the reason I removed that slide is because we don't know how much of this sex. I think I asked it anyway in this slide, but it was going to be my concluding slide as a call for more research, so that we understand how much of transactional sex is promoted by consumerism and how much of it is linked to poverty. That's a question that we have not answered in this country, and I think it's important that we answer that question as well. Thanks, Zonele.
Okay, Prof. And then Palisa is asking to please clarify the book, Babies and Books for Babies. The author's name, Prof, that would be...
Okay, I'll post it here.
Okay, thank you, Prof. And then back to Bongiwe, right? So Bongiwe is asking, would you be suggesting decriminalization of sex work for minors?
So today was not about decriminalization of sex work for minors. I do not think we should be decriminalizing sex work for minors, but we can have a conversation about what sex work with minors mean. But I don't think we should be decriminalizing sex work for minors.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Then our next question from Nobi. In general terms, what is a difference between sex work and transactional sex?
There is research that differentiates that. Because people engage in sexual relationships and they receive benefits from these relationships, but they do not consider themselves to be engaged in sex work per se. So in sex work, people ahead of time, for example, would negotiate and agree because they know that they are in a trade, they are in a particular relationship where I will charge. In transactional relationships, it's a normal relationship. It exists. There is no charge. Sex work is not a relationship. Yes, you may have a regular client, but it does not turn that into a relationship. So sex work is not a relationship where there are benefits that are material. Sex work is work where I provide the service. You pay me what I charge for my service. In transactional relationships, there is no fixed charge. So it's nice if you pay for my school fees, but if you don't, it's nice if you buy me groceries. But if you don't, it's nice if you pay for my clothes or my hairstyle. In transactional relationships, usually there is no pre-agreement and fixed agreement, it's fluid. But in sex work, I don't want my client in sex work to be nice to me by buying me something. I want them to pay me the money that we've agreed on. But you can read more about the difference between sex work and transactional sexual relationships.
Okay, Prof. So our last comment is from Roger. Roger is saying that in a certain region in Malawi, young girls were provided financial support and resources as lack of those was viewed to be a major barrier for girls to stay in school. A year down the line, almost 39% dropped out of school because boys deliberately impregnated them out of anger, that they are being favored by NGOs and the boys have been left behind. So Prof. Roger he's in favor of your power argument.
So I think we need another conversation about boys and retaliation.
Okay, so Prof, that's it for our questions posted in the chat, and we don't have any hands raised. So I'm going to end our session here. Prof, thank you on behalf of Sachi and all the participants that attended as well for your very delightful presentation. I know on another given day that we so much more conversation, especially because there seems a lot more that people want to discuss about boys as well. So thank you so much, Prof, for sharing your presentation with us as well. And we hope to see more of you in the future. Also, thank you to the participants for attending and also sharing your insights and your questions with us to make this session very interactive and successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Shanaz, for organizing the session. Thank you, Nompilo and Prof. Maharaj for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be with this space.
Okay. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.